Good morning, everyone. Good morning, dear procurement people. Have a cup of coffee, take a seat, and let's start a three-part mini-series in this video and podcast about agile methodologies in procurement. But before we do that, as always, let's kick it off with the intro.
Are you looking to up your negotiation and procurement skills? You're in the right place. Welcome to Procurement Zen with your host, Phil Kowalski.
All right, so Agile, right? Agile is one of the big buzzwords that we're hearing everywhere. We need to be more agile, but what does that mean? Well, in the next 3 episodes, we will cover basically some of the most important frameworks. And today, we start with the most prominent one, which is SCRUM. In addition, we will also cover how we can use these practices for our purposes, although we procurement people are usually not software developers. SCRUM was created in the 90s by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland when several very gifted people came together and discovered that the old way of doing software development, that's where it comes from, was maybe not working as expected. So let me give you an overview how it all works. So as a so-called product owner in Scrum, you create user stories, which represent certain features of a project if you want. And in software, this could be, for example, a button. In a contract, to take it to our example, this could be a clause. So user stories are following a predefined format. And let me just quickly switch to presentation mode here. And let me show you how this all works. Just a moment. I just have to switch screens here. So let's go to presentation mode. All right, the user story. So the user story is basically for the involvement of a team, is a feature that a team member is working on. And the user stories usually follow a predefined format. And it's basically in Scrum. We will cover this in the other parts of the series as well, but because user stories are an element that we can see everywhere. But the most general version of it goes like, as a description of a user, I want a certain feature so that I can benefit. So that could be, for example, be as a as a buyer, I want a limitation of liability clause in my contract so that we can make sure that liabilities are covered the right way. Or as a demand owner, I want technical and operational measures in my cybersecurity annex so that we can process data in a safe way. What is important about the user story is that the user stories take, as the word says, the user's point of view and try to explain it to the development or project team. So let's go on. So these user stories, go basically in what is called a backlog, and that's also a term you will hear in Agile methodologies quite a lot. The product backlog or the user story backlog or the project backlog is basically where all these little small requirements go in. And then the so-called product owner, which is a kind of sponsor to the project, decides which user stories get on works next, and they go into a so-called sprint backlog. That's also very typical for agile methodologies. They work in short increments called sprints. Usually they are 2 to 4 weeks long. So you don't wait like months to finish things, but instead you work on a certain subset derived from your capacity of user stories for a certain amount of time. So an interdisciplinary team then starts working on these user stories in an iteration called a sprint. That's what we just discussed. Important is that the team decides on its own who does which user story. So it goes into a sprint, and the team then works on those user stories. And that's very different from classical project management methods. There is not a project manager that says, Joe, you work on topic A, and Jill, you work on topic B. No, the team, Joe and Jill and Tim and Tom and whoever is in it, optimal size of a team, by the way, is usually 5 to 7 people, each decides on their own on which user story they're going to work. That's also very fundamental to all kinds of agile working methods, but especially to Scrum. So then it goes into this sprint, and one very important ceremony in the sprint is what is called the daily stand-up or the daily Scrum. And in the daily stand-up, the team comes together with the Scrum Master, which is kind of mixture between a project manager and a moderator of the team. They come together, they talk about what they have done, what they have been worked on in the last day, and also any obstacles, any problems that arose. And then it's the Scrum Master's task to get the obstacles out of the way for the team. But very important, it is not an extensive meeting. They usually talk briefly, and I have been part of meetings where everyone was allowed 60 to 90 seconds. So better think twice before you start your talking. Maybe you want to prepare this a little bit so you make sure you meet the expected time frame. So what is very important, I said that already, the Scrum Master does not assign tasks to team members. That's something they do themselves. So at the end of the sprint, a usable result is published. In software development, that could be a working application or an app increment if you want. In contract, this could be a finalized schedule, for example. So now that we know the rough framework, let's just, I'm switching screens here again. So now that we know the rough framework, let's see how can we apply this to our procurement work. A product, as said before, could be a contract with a supplier. The clauses become the user stories. The demand owner is the product owner. The negotiation lead is managing the team and will present the results to the product owner as well as to the supplier. So he works as kind of a Scrum Master here. He coordinates the team as we usually do in negotiations. But different than the original Scrum, here the Scrum Master or the negotiation lead in such an approach can also actively participate in the negotiation, take over user stories, and also deal with the supplier. And there are also some very neat practices in Scrum we can use in our daily life besides contract negotiations. For example, there is something that is called planning poker in Scrum, and in planning poker you usually assign a point value to a user story, and that point value represents the effort one team member sees for that user story. How difficult is it? How much effort does it take to implement that feature? And then basically you usually play this with playing cards, and then you play the cards, and if you have basically all numbers together or very similar, then a number gets assigned. However, if you have outliers, the outliers, the very low and the very high number, one says, well, it's no effort at all, while the other says it's a huge effort, they usually discuss, and then the whole team plays another round of planning poker. And one example where I have used this to a great success is in a game of what I called evaluation poker. So basically you get an offer evaluation. You, prior to receiving the offers, you determine what are the questions you want to have answered, and then you use these playing cards and discuss why do you see it as a 1, a 13 if you played with numbers, or as an ace, or as a 3, right? So and then you play the same round, and that's how you come to a joint offer evaluation, and I've done that to great success. So this basically concludes our part 1 on our mini-series of Agile methodologies and procurement. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can of course also go to our website. If you're listening to the podcast, you will find the podcasting notes over at www.procurementzen.com/037. I just had to look what episode it was. So that's procurementzen.com/037 for episode 37. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about design thinking. It will be a little bit of a longer episode, but very interesting, I can promise you. So make sure to subscribe, both if listening to the podcast or watching the video on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe, and always happy negotiations. See you tomorrow.